Feminist, a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. For a very extensive chapter of human history, the primary goal of women's existence has been marriage. Why? Because of women's perceived inferiority to men. From the dawn of the agricultural revolution to the Victorian era and up to the modern day, the prevailing belief has been that men are superior to women in every way. Consequently, society believes that marriage is how women achieve greater social mobility, greater economic stability, and how they overcome their natural weaknesses. But what does this mean? Social mobility, the ability to move up to higher social classes in one's society. Particularly in the Victorian era, social status was viewed as something very important, and women were encouraged to marry up on the social ladder. This is still relevant today, whether referring to social classes or a family as a social unit. Women are still expected to achieve certain norms to be able to gain social status. Economic stability, the ability to support oneself. For centuries, marriage has been the only way women could find any means of economic support. Of course, in a marriage, a woman is not directly supporting herself, but rather depending on a man for her stability. And natural weaknesses? Women and men are physiologically different. Anytime there are differences, there will be a perceived inferior and a perceived superior. Unfortunately, in this case, women often get the short end of the stick. Marriage is the central aspect to both Anne Bronte's novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Factors affecting marriage are also addressed in both works. Society values marriage, regardless of a woman's fulfillment and happiness. That theme is central in both works, despite the settings and cultural variances.
The odds of winning the Powerball jackpot are 1 in 175 million. For Victorian women, maintaining a marriage was that difficult, if not more difficult. So in Chapter 1 of our thesis project, we analyzed Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, with our 3 tenets: social mobility, economic limitations, and the weaknesses of women.
In Tenant, the driving factor is the status of Helen's marriage, or lack thereof. As a young woman, Helen goes against the wishes of her guardians and marries a rogue young man with lots of debt and crippling vices. Their marriage deteriorates rapidly and becomes abusive. Once Helen finally escapes him, she goes to live as a widow in her brother's empty house. Although she's no longer confined to him, she is still subject to the confines of a woman living in the Victorian era. She relates all this to her friend Gilbert and eventually marries Gilbert after caring for her estranged husband on his deathbed.
So our first tenet is social mobility, and this applies to Helen's marital states, both when she isn't married and she's seeking suitors, and when she acts as a widow. So first, when she's seeking a suitor, her first suitor, or one of her first suitors, is Mr. Borum. And whenever she is involved in his courtship, she doesn't want to marry him, but it doesn't matter to anyone around her, including Mr. Borum and her guardians, because he has a higher social status than she does. And that's the primary reason that women were driven to seek marriage, is to get a higher social status. Then, whenever she's a single woman, she doesn't have the ability to participate in her community. She is shunned by her community, and she simply doesn't have the social status she had in her marriage and the opportunity to gain whenever she was courting suitors. So Bronte also demonstrates that Victorian society pushed women to seek marriage because they were economically limited. When they weren't married, they were dependent on their fathers for money, and they needed some source of income, so they had to get married, right? Alright, so Helen had several instances where it's shown that economic limitations were a factor in her marriage. So before she's married and she has suitors, her guardians are very concerned with how much money her future husband will have. So just like Mr. Borum had the social status that they wanted her to have, Mr. Wilmot had the money. So he was a particularly attractive suitor to them. They didn't really care whether Helen wanted to marry the old man or not. Then whenever Helen is a destitute single woman, she's still dependent on a man for her economic support. And the little support that she does have autonomy over isn't viable unless her brother can sell her paintings. And even when Helen is within a marriage, she doesn't have a lot of economic autonomy. Her husband has control of all of her finances, and with just a little bit of his dissatisfaction, he can take all of her finances away. He can make sure she doesn't have enough to run away from him, the abusive situation she's in. So even though Victorian society pushed women to get married to be economically less limited, in essence, they never became autonomous in the truest sense of the word. So another reason that women were encouraged to seek marriage and essentially pressured into it was because they were perceived to have weaknesses. Natural weaknesses such as physical, emotional, intellectual. Obviously, we know that's not true, but then they thought it was. In regards to Helen's marriage decision, she's treated like a child by almost everyone who's involved in that decision. Her suitors, her eventual husband, and her guardians. So one of her suitors that we talked about earlier, Mr. Borum, decides that she doesn't know how to say no when she says, "No, I don't want to marry you." He completely disregards her thoughts and her intellectual prowess and knowledge that she doesn't want to marry him. Then, whenever she is married to Mr. Huntington, he completely disregards her devotion, her religious devotion, and asks her essentially to be less religious because he doesn't like it. Her guardians also expect her to be passive because of her perceived natural weaknesses. They tell her essentially that she shouldn't seek anyone's affections, and that once someone declares that they have affections for her and intend to marry her, she's expected to say yes, no matter what she thinks, what she feels, because marriage is the remedy to her natural weaknesses. So marriage is still utilized as a means of regulating women. Just like in Bronte's Tenant of Wildfell Hall, the driving factor in My Big Fat Greek Wedding is the protagonist Tula's marital status. So in Chapter 2 of our thesis project, we analyzed the film My Big Fat Greek Wedding, directed by Joel Zwick, also using the same three tenets of feminist critical theory.
Tula, a 30-something Greek woman past her expiration date, works in her father's restaurant, although she has greater aspirations. Her family is obsessed with her marital status. One day, she meets Ian Miller and everything changes. Although her family objects strongly to the relationship she pursues with him, eventually they are satisfied that she ends up married.
In Tula's family, the primary mode of social mobility for women was marriage. Before Tula pursues a relationship that could result in marriage, she is treated as a subordinate in her family and is patronized by her family members because she fails to live up to the expected role of a young Greek woman. Zwick demonstrates through the character of Tula how a woman's marital status directly relates to her value in society. Tula's sister, Athena, is presented as a foil, shown as being beautiful, knowledgeable about her Greek heritage, and married with a family. It is made clear that Tula would be elevated socially if she were to marry, as evidenced by Athena, who embodies the ideal Greek woman. This comparison demonstrates that marriage is valued as a tool for social mobility because the woman who isn't married is clearly socially inferior to the woman who is. Just like Helen in Tenant of Wildfell Hall faces economic destitution without the support of a man, Tula is similarly limited by the fact that she is bound to her father for financial support until she gets married. Tula, although she is well past college age, still lives in her father's house and has no economic independence because of the structure of her traditional Greek society. Because she is not married, she works for her father. Thus, her father is her only source of income. Through the character of Tula's father, and his insistence that she marry as not to be a burden on her family, Zwick emphasizes the economically dependent position of women. Once Tula sees Ian and begins pursuing him as a legitimate marriage option, she has renewed motivation to improve herself and her economic standing. Even though she is superseding her father's control on her life, she is only able to do this in terms of a pursuit of marriage. Zwick showcases that self-improvement for a woman is only acceptable in the context of a man. In My Big Fat Greek Wedding, through Gus Portocullis' opinions about women's education and his insistence on exerting his authority over his entire household, women are portrayed as the more vulnerable sex, and in need of marriage for that reason. Gus doesn't want his household of women to be truly educated, just educated enough to teach their children Greek culture. Just as Helen in Tenant is not taken seriously in her piety, Tula's desire for education is not taken seriously without Maria Portocullis twisting her husband's arm. Speaking of Maria Portocullis, Tula's mother, Maria, knows very well her position she has in society, and she knows exactly how to manipulate the men in her life from that situation, which she sums up in her memorable quote, "The man is the head of the house, but the woman is the neck, and she can turn the head any way she wants." Using the only tools at her disposal and remaining within the confines of womanly characteristics, Maria wields as much power as she is able in her deeply patriarchal culture.
Now we get to what we really wanted to talk about, the flaws. Because let's face it, even perfect literature isn't perfect. In both works, the strong, singular leading ladies are only moved to action by love for a man. In Tenant of Wildfell Hall, the entire action of the plot centers around Helen's decision to marry. The good feminist meat of the novel showcases Helen's struggles to escape an abusive marriage and her eventual success in supporting herself and her young son. She even amasses considerable wealth through the inheritance she receives upon her uncle's death. She's single, rich, and beautiful, and she has a lot of life ahead of her now that her husband's vice has effectively snuffed him out. But included in the novel is an extremely out-of-place, clumsy love story between Helen and Gilbert that results in their marriage at the end. Everything is already resolved, so why is this addition necessary? Why would she choose to entangle her money and her life with a man yet again, especially a man below her own considerably improved economic and social status? Because in her society, and in society throughout most of history, a single woman could never be single for long, and could not be written to be so independent. Thus, Helen's own narrative packages her up nicely with an ordinary farmer in the end, after the more interesting conflict has already concluded. She doesn't need to marry him for the economic stability or protection from the outside world. She's far above him in a multitude of ways, but because she is a woman, she cannot remain unmarried for it to be a truly happy ending. And even though it is a chick flick, we can't ignore how conventional Tula's unconventional marriage really is in My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Tula's life is so stagnant for so long. She works in the restaurant, she's not married, she gets shown gross old suitors, she gets pestered by her father for being old herself, and she fears that her life will never change. But as soon as Ian Miller, with his long, luscious locks, steps into the restaurant, she has a motivation to improve herself. And yes, he's not Greek. Yes, she seeks him out on her own. But the fact still remains that Tula cannot help herself out of her situation until her goal is to catch the attention of a man. That change in her life can only be initiated by male interest. And to top it all off, she ends up married and having babies, just like everyone else. When you boil it down, the primary goal of both Tula and her father turns out to be the exact same thing. Now, we're not saying that marriage is the problem, or that marriage and family is wrong or anti-feminist in any way. It's the idea that, even in the modern day, a woman's consciousness is believed to center around a relationship with a man as a preservation of the social order. Real, concrete career and education goals fall short of that ultimate existential question: to marry or not to marry? Now, I would definitely identify myself as a feminist, and after this analysis, I've come to a greater understanding of the deep-seated social ills still setting women's goals as less important than men's. And I've realized how important it is that in a relationship, my partner will not be the primary focus of my life, and my partner should support my goals as much as I support theirs. This may seem like a relatively minor example in the grand scheme of things, but I'm going to Tulane University next year, and my boyfriend will be a senior at Catholic High next year. Despite the difficulties that the separation may cause, he knows that Tulane is the right place for me and the things that I'm seeking in my life. And he's insisted that I pursue my dreams and follow the path I need to take. And if we are still together, I plan to do the same for him, to help him achieve whatever goal he wants to achieve in whatever place he wants to go. We're equal. We support each other's interests. We respect each other's independence, regardless of gender. An idea that in the 21st century shouldn't be so revolutionary, but I found that it really is for so many people.
Both of our works, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and My Big Fat Greek Wedding, despite the drastic differences in their settings, show that society values marriage regardless of a woman's fulfillment or happiness.